The woods of rural Alabama have a way of swallowing sound, especially in the years before roads cut through them and laws reached their roots. In 1894, the trees stood close together, their branches tangled like clenched fingers, guarding secrets no one dared to name aloud. Travelers avoided that stretch of land, not because it was marked on any map, but because something about it felt wrong, too quiet, too watchful. Even the birds seemed to hesitate before crossing the property line. The family who lived there had always kept to themselves. The parents were known as strict, deeply private, the kind who believed the world beyond the woods was corrupt and dangerous. Their children grew up without school, without church, without voices other than those echoing inside the cabin walls. To outsiders, they looked obedient, almost fragile. But isolation does not preserve innocence, it reshapes it. One autumn, neighbors noticed the parents were no longer seen. No arguments drifting through the trees, no figures working the land. When asked, the children answered calmly, saying their mother and father had gone away, that it was better this way. Their eyes never lingered on the person asking. They always glanced toward the forest, toward the old well everyone pretended not to remember. At night, faint metallic sounds traveled through the woods, slow and deliberate, like something being lowered inch by inch into darkness. Those who heard it told themselves it was the wind, or animals, or imagination. In places like this, denial was safer than curiosity. Years later, when the truth began to surface, it would be said that the horror was not sudden, nor born of madness, but carefully planned. What happened in those woods was not just an act of cruelty, it was the final, desperate reversal of power inside a family that had been rotting in silence for decades. And the well, waiting patiently beneath the trees, remembered everything. The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive as a scream or a crime, but as silence, the kind that settles slowly and convinces people it has always been there. In rural Alabama in 1894, isolation was common, yet this particular homestead had once carried small, ordinary sounds into the surrounding woods: the scrape of tools against soil, the distant cough of the father at dawn, the mother's voice calling from the porch. When those sounds vanished, no one spoke of it at first. Neighbors told themselves that weather, illness, or simple privacy explained the absence, because explanation was easier than suspicion. Days passed, then weeks, and the silence deepened. Smoke no longer rose from the cabin chimney in the mornings. The field went untouched, weeds climbing where crops had been carefully tended. A mule was heard braying at night, unattended and restless, its cries echoing farther than any human voice dared to travel. Those who lived nearest felt the change most sharply, as though the land itself had exhaled and refused to breathe again. Rumors began as half-spoken thoughts exchanged at fences and general stores. Someone mentioned that they had not seen the parents in some time. Someone else admitted they had the same uneasy feeling but dismissed it as gossip. In a place governed by distance and self-reliance, asking questions about another family's affairs was considered dangerous, almost disrespectful. Yet curiosity crept in quietly, carried by glances toward the woods and pauses that stretched too long in conversation. The children were still seen, moving between the cabin and the forest with a strange purpose. They avoided eye contact, their steps measured, their expressions unreadable. There was nothing openly threatening about them, and that made their presence more unsettling. They behaved as if nothing had changed, as if the world beyond their property had simply ceased to exist. When greeted, they responded politely but briefly, their voices flat, as though repeating lines practiced in private. What disturbed the neighbors most was not what they saw, but what they felt. The land around the homestead seemed to reject intrusion. Dogs refused to follow trails leading toward the property. Hunters found their paths inexplicably shifting away from it. Even the air felt heavier there, carrying a damp, metallic scent that lingered in memory long after leaving. By the time the whispers grew bold enough to carry names and theories, the silence had already done its work. It had numbed the instinct to intervene, softened the boundary between normal life and unthinkable possibility, and wrapped the truth in a layer of doubt so thick that even those who sensed danger chose to look away, convinced that whatever had happened behind the trees was not meant to be seen, only felt, like a shadow stretched too far across the ground. The second crack in the fragile calm came not during the day, but after sunset, when the woods took on their truest shape and the past felt closest to the surface. Neighbors began to notice lantern lights drifting between the trees long after night had settled, moving slowly and deliberately, never hurried, never random. At first, these lights were dismissed as routine chores or hunting trips, yet something about their timing felt wrong. No animal trap required tending at midnight, and no harvest waited beneath a moonless sky. Those who watched more closely realized the lights always came in pairs. Two figures walked together, their silhouettes thin and rigid, the lantern glow swinging low as if weighed down. On still nights, when the wind fell quiet, a faint clinking sound followed them, soft but unmistakable. It was not the careless jangle of tools or the shifting of loose metal. It was the sound of iron meeting iron, slow and controlled, as though whoever carried it understood its weight and purpose. The children of the household were known to keep odd hours, raised without the structure most families followed. Even so, their nocturnal movements unsettled the few who dared observe them. They did not laugh or speak to one another as they walked. Their heads remained lowered, eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead, as if afraid to look too far into the darkness surrounding them. When a lantern flame flickered, one would stop instantly, shielding it with a hand until the light steadied again. Whispers spread quickly once the pattern became impossible to ignore. A farmhand claimed he saw heavy links draped over one child's shoulder, catching the lantern light like dull silver. Another swore the chains were dragged behind them, leaving shallow lines in the dirt that vanished by morning. Each retelling grew more vivid, though no one could say they had witnessed the same moment twice. Fear thrives in fragments, and these fragments stitched themselves into something larger than truth. What confused the community most was the children's calm during daylight. They showed no exhaustion, no marks on their hands, no sign that they had spent hours wandering the forest floor. Their clothes were clean, their posture steady. When questioned indirectly, they offered simple answers about tending to family matters, about responsibilities that could not be delayed. The words sounded reasonable, yet carried no warmth, no invitation to ask more. Night after night, the lanterns returned, always following the same direction deeper into the woods, toward land long abandoned and paths no one used anymore. The sound of chains faded and returned, sometimes stopping for long stretches before resuming. Those who lay awake listening began to sense that the children were not hiding their actions, but performing them openly, confident that no one would interfere. It was this quiet confidence, more than the chains themselves, that marked the moment when suspicion hardened into dread, and the unthinkable began to feel not only possible, but inevitable. The disappearance of the parents was explained with words so simple that they almost discouraged doubt. When neighbors finally gathered the nerve to ask, the children spoke calmly of a journey, a necessary departure brought on by matters no one else needed to understand. There was no urgency in their voices, no grief, no visible confusion. They spoke as if reciting a settled fact, something already finished and closed. In a time when families often vanished westward or retreated deeper into isolation, such explanations were not unheard of, yet this one felt strangely hollow. The parents had never been travelers. They mistrusted roads, avoided towns, and believed that distance weakened authority. For them to leave without selling land, without notifying anyone, without even taking livestock, contradicted everything they had lived by. Still, the children insisted their mother and father had chosen to go, that it was their will alone. When pressed about destinations or dates, the answers grew vague, shifting just enough to deflect further inquiry without outright refusal. What unsettled those listening was not the inconsistency, but the children's ease in delivering it. They showed no nervous habits, no glances exchanged between them, no cracks in their composure. They stood side by side, presenting a united front that felt rehearsed rather than instinctive. It was as if the story had been decided long before anyone thought to ask the question. Silence had been their preparation, and now words were being used only as a shield. Daily life on the property continued in a distorted imitation of normalcy. The children took over tasks their parents once controlled, working the land with a rigid discipline that bordered on obsession. They avoided the cabin porch where their mother had spent her afternoons and no longer entered the small outbuilding their father used for tools. Certain spaces became untouchable, as though crossing those thresholds might disturb something carefully arranged. In the surrounding community, Doubt lingered but failed to take shape. People repeated the children's explanation to one another, each time sanding away the parts that felt wrong until only the most acceptable version remained. It was easier to believe the parents had left than to imagine they had been forced to stay. Fear has a way of disguising itself as reason, and reason told them there was no proof of wrongdoing. Yet small details refused to settle. A letter addressed to the father was returned unopened. A debt the parents always paid on time went unanswered. Familiar habits vanished overnight, replaced by routines that felt hollow and mechanical. Even the land seemed confused by the change, producing little despite the children's relentless effort. As weeks turned into months, the absence hardened into something permanent. The explanation, repeated often enough, began to feel real, not because it was convincing, but because no one challenged it strongly enough to shatter it. The parents became ghosts while still officially alive, erased by a story that required everyone to look away, and in that collective turning of heads, the truth slipped quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The first sounds were so faint that those who heard them questioned their own senses. Late at night, when the forest settled into its deepest stillness, a low echo drifted through the trees, rising and falling with no clear rhythm. It was not an animal's cry, nor the groan of wind through branches. It carried a hollow quality, as though it were climbing upward from a place never meant to be heard from. People paused in their beds, holding their breath, waiting for it to repeat, and when it did, unease replaced curiosity. The source seemed to be the old well, long abandoned and half hidden by brush at the far edge of the woods. No one used it anymore, not since a newer water source had been dug closer to settled land. Children had once been warned away from it, told stories of collapsing stone and bottomless depth. Over time, it faded into memory, becoming just another forgotten feature swallowed by vines and moss. Yet now, sound had given it presence again. Those closest to the forest described the noises differently, though all agreed they came from the same direction. Some heard muffled thuds, spaced far apart, as if something heavy shifted against stone. Others claimed they heard voices, too distorted to form words, rising briefly before being swallowed again by the earth. A few insisted it was the sound of metal scraping rock, slow and deliberate, sending vibrations through the ground rather than the air. Fear spread quietly, feeding on imagination and doubt. People avoided speaking directly about the well, referring to it instead as that place or down there. To name it felt dangerous, as if doing so might draw attention or invite the sound closer. Dogs whimpered and refused to settle at night, ears twitching toward the woods. Livestock grew restless, pacing enclosures until exhaustion overtook them. What disturbed the community most was the timing. The sounds often followed the children's nighttime journeys, beginning shortly after the lantern lights disappeared into the forest and ending long before dawn. On nights when the lanterns did not appear, the woods remained silent. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, yet no one dared follow it to its source. Curiosity battled fear, and fear won every time. Those who tried to investigate during daylight found nothing definitive. The well stood quiet, its opening dark and unyielding, offering no sign of recent disturbance. Birds perched on its stone rim without hesitation, and insects crawled freely along its edges. In the sun, it appeared harmless, almost forgotten, as if the night itself transformed it into something else entirely. As the echoes continued, sleep became fractured and nerves frayed. People began to listen for the sounds even on quiet nights, straining for proof that they were real. The well became a presence in their thoughts, a place imagined far more vividly than it was ever seen. Whatever lay beneath it remained unseen, but the noises carried enough weight to suggest intention, suffering, and a depth of darkness that could not be filled by earth alone. As the strange sounds continued to haunt the nights, the children's behavior shifted in ways that unsettled even those who tried hardest to mind their own affairs. During the day, they moved through the community with an unnatural calm, faces composed, voices steady, as though nothing in the world could disturb them. Yet beneath that calm lay a rigidity that felt forced, like a mask worn too long. Simple questions were met with clipped answers, and friendly gestures were acknowledged with polite distance rather than warmth. They began to appear less often in public spaces, timing their visits to the store or mill when few others were present. When they did encounter neighbors, they stood closer together than before, shoulders nearly touching, presenting themselves as a single unit rather than individuals. Their eyes scanned constantly, not with fear, but with calculation, measuring who was watching and for how long. Any mention of their parents caused an immediate change, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a pause too deliberate to be natural. Defensiveness crept into their words, though never openly. They did not deny the questions outright, but redirected them, turning simple curiosity into an intrusion. They spoke of privacy, of family matters best left alone, repeating phrases that sounded learned rather than felt. The more they insisted on normalcy, the less believable it became. It was not what they said, but how carefully they said it, that raised alarm. At home, their routines grew severe and repetitive. The same tasks were performed at the same hours, with no deviation. Lamps were extinguished early, doors barred tightly, and windows covered despite the heat. Anyone passing nearby felt watched, even when no one was visible. The property seemed to shrink inward, becoming a closed system that rejected outside presence. Children who once lingered near the woods were warned away, not by parents, but by instinct. There was a sense that crossing into the siblings' orbit carried consequences, though no threat was ever spoken aloud. Even animals reacted differently, horses shying away when led past the land, chickens refusing to roam near the fence line. What made their behavior most disturbing was the absence of guilt or panic. If they were hiding something, it did not trouble their sleep or cloud their judgment. Instead, they carried themselves with the confidence of those who believe their actions are justified. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when one might glimpse something colder beneath the surface, a look that lingered too long or a smile that failed to reach the eyes. As suspicion grew, so did the sense that confronting them directly would change nothing. The children did not behave like people afraid of discovery, but like guardians standing watch over something already decided. Their calm felt permanent, their silence intentional, and their presence increasingly heavy, as though the truth itself had taken residence within them, shaping every movement, every word, every breath into a quiet warning that whatever lay hidden was not meant to be undone. The first tangible evidence arrived through the eyes of a local hunter, a man familiar with every curve of the forest floor and every whisper of its undergrowth. He had long avoided the property out of caution, aware of the stories that had settled like dust over the old homestead, but curiosity, like a quiet ember, finally drove him toward the well under the cover of afternoon light. The forest seemed different that day, more deliberate in its silence, as though it recognized the intrusion and held its breath in anticipation. As he approached the clearing, the ground betrayed subtle disturbances. The earth surrounding the well had been shifted, compacted in ways inconsistent with natural erosion. Small tufts of grass were flattened, as if something heavy had been dragged across them repeatedly. Rusted chains lay partially buried in the soil, twisted into half-formed coils that suggested they had been used, then hidden in haste. Even in daylight, the sight sent a shiver through him, for it confirmed the stories whispered at night were no longer just tales of imagination. The hunter crouched closer, noting faint scratches along the stone edges of the well, marks that seemed too deliberate to be caused by the weather or by passing animals. The air carried a faint metallic tang, subtle but undeniable, and it clung to his senses, provoking a visceral unease he could not shake. Something heavy had moved in the shadows below, something that should not have been there. The realization forced him to step back and reconsider the stories he had long ignored. They were not mere superstition, they were warning. He traced the path that led away from the well, observing the impressions left behind. Footprints were uneven, shod in heavy boots, yet their pattern was meticulous, almost ceremonial, as if each step had been considered and placed with purpose. Rust flecked the soil where chains had dragged along the ground. Evidence of deliberate movement, methodical, patient, and chilling. The pattern spoke not of panic, but of calculation. Whoever, or whatever, had used the chains had acted with intent, and the thought weighed on him like a shadow pressing from the ground upward. When he returned to the village, the hunter spoke cautiously, sharing only fragments at first. The community listened, disbelief mixing with a rising tension they could no longer ignore. The land itself seemed complicit in the horror, holding tight to its secrets even as the hunter unveiled its smallest betrayals. It was no longer possible to pretend that the forest was passive, that the homestead was simply abandoned. The well and its surrounding soil had become a silent witness, a grim testament to acts hidden for too long, and those who heard the story could not help but sense that this was only the beginning of understanding what had truly unfolded behind the trees. As the hunter's discovery spread quietly through the community, whispers began to stir in corners long accustomed to silence. Town elders, men and women who had known the family for generations, remembered details that most had buried under polite civility or fear of gossip. They spoke hesitantly, their voices low and measured, as if repeating them aloud might resurrect consequences they had long avoided. Stories emerged of the family's history of isolation, of disputes over land and inheritance that had never been resolved, and of a strange insistence on secrecy that had been remarked upon but rarely challenged. The elders recalled the parents' strict control over every aspect of their children's lives, how curiosity was discouraged, how any venture outside the property was met with suspicion or outright prohibition. The family had lived apart from the rest of the community, drawing their sustenance and habits entirely from the land they possessed. Outsiders had often assumed this was a choice born of pride or eccentricity, not realizing that such isolation allowed darker dynamics to fester unchecked. The house had been more than a home, it was a world unto itself, carefully monitored and governed by rules known only to those inside. Rumors about the children's behavior were reframed in light of this context. Elders spoke of odd events from years past, the occasional disappearance of the parents for hours at a time, the children's uncanny ability to anticipate household needs without direction, the fearful deference of animals in the property's vicinity. Small details that had once seemed trivial now assumed ominous significance. Each recollection layered unease upon unease, creating a mosaic of warning that had gone unheeded simply because no one wanted to confront it. Discussions among the elders also hinted at unresolved conflicts over inheritance and control. The family's holdings were substantial for the area, and some speculated that greed, resentment, or fear of losing power might have played a role in shaping the children's actions. They recalled whispered threats, veiled arguments, and a rigidity in the parents' authority that left no room for negotiation. It was clear that the tension within the household had not been random, it had been cultivated and enforced, a seed of resentment planted over decades and nurtured in isolation. By the time the full story began to surface, the elders' recollections provided a chilling frame for what had happened. The truth was not born solely in the act itself but in a history of control, secrecy, and unchallenged authority. It revealed a family that had lived according to its own rules, immune to outside scrutiny, and allowed a nightmare to fester until it reached its inevitable conclusion. The community was forced to confront not only the horror of the present but the weight of what had been overlooked, a reminder that some legacies of isolation carry consequences that echo far beyond the walls that contain them. When the evidence finally began to surface, authorities hesitated, caught between disbelief and the growing weight of suspicion. The claims were extraordinary. A family had vanished into the forest, strange metallic sounds had echoed through the night, and the land itself seemed to guard a secret too grim to imagine. Lawmen, used to dealing with thefts, disputes, and occasional violence, were unprepared for a situation that straddled the line between legend and reality. Their caution was not born of negligence but of uncertainty. The world they patrolled had boundaries, and this horror seemed to exist outside them. Reports reached the county seat slowly, filtered through neighbors, hunters, and gossiping children. Each retelling layered the story with additional tension, embellishment, and fear. Authorities questioned witnesses carefully, weighing every word against what they knew of the family's reputation. The parents were remembered as stern, private people, and the children were considered peculiar at best. Yet no one could deny the patterns: the absent parents, the nighttime lanterns, the faint clinking of chains, and the disturbed earth near the old well. Even the most skeptical officer could not ignore the accumulation of anomalies. When investigators first arrived at the homestead, they found little beyond the ordinary, at least on the surface. The cabin stood intact, doors locked but unbroken, the yard overgrown but otherwise undisturbed. It appeared, at first glance, that the family had simply chosen to disappear. Yet the land around the well suggested another story. Chains half buried in the soil, shallow impressions of feet and metal, and marks along the stone rim whispered of deliberate activity that no legend could fabricate. Still, in daylight, The scene lacked the immediacy and terror described in hushed conversations. Without direct witnesses, the officers were left to balance their professional skepticism against the mounting weight of evidence. The hesitation was compounded by social pressures. Some neighbors urged investigation, while others warned against digging too deeply into matters that seemed better left untouched. Fear had long gripped the community, and even lawmen were reluctant to provoke it further. In rural Alabama, stories carried consequences. Challenging them too openly could bring retaliation, gossip, or the suspicion of interfering in affairs beyond one's comprehension. This delicate balance left authorities in a state of paralysis. As the days stretched into weeks, the sense of unease only grew. Every visit to the property revealed small, inexplicable details: lanterns found burning low at dusk, subtle signs of recent movement near the cabin, and the persistent metallic echoes from the well that no one could entirely explain. Each anomaly reinforced the belief that something sinister had occurred, yet the officers remained cautious, unwilling to declare a crime without incontrovertible proof. Their indecision mirrored the community's own fear, a shared recognition that this was not a typical violation of law or order, but something darker, deliberate, and carefully concealed, lying just beyond the reach of certainty. The day the well was finally opened, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the anticipation of revelation. Authorities, guided by the hunters' careful observations and the mounting accounts of neighbors, arrived with ropes, lanterns, and cautious determination. Every step toward the clearing felt measured, the ground beneath their boots soft with fallen leaves yet disturbed in ways that hinted at unseen activity. Even the sunlight filtering through the branches seemed hesitant, casting fractured shadows over the stone rim as if unwilling to fully illuminate what lay below. When the first rope was lowered into the darkness, the silence around the well grew almost unbearable. No wind stirred, no birds called, and the faint metallic tang that had long clung to the clearing seemed stronger, pressing against the senses of those who peered over the edge. As the bucket scraped against stone, every observer held their breath, waiting for proof of what they already feared. The echoes of chains and footsteps that had haunted the nights for months were suddenly given form, tethered to a reality far grimmer than anyone had dared imagine. What emerged was immediate and undeniable. Heavy iron links, corroded but unmistakably shaped for restraint, were intertwined with remnants of clothing and ropes, evidence of deliberate confinement. The bucket revealed the careful labor that had gone into the concealment, suggesting methodical intent rather than a moment of rash cruelty. The arrangement of the chains and the condition of the interior indicated a prolonged imprisonment, a slow and calculated act that defied any simple explanation. The observers shivered, not only at the material evidence but at the thought of what human will had orchestrated it. Beyond the physical remnants, the well seemed to hold an atmosphere of its own, a presence that pressed against the mind. Those standing nearby reported a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like slow breathing or the soft dragging of weight along stone, impossible to trace but impossible to ignore. Some recoiled instinctively, as if the place itself recoiled from being disturbed, its darkness not merely empty but filled with memory, with suffering, with secrets that had been waiting decades for discovery. The implications were devastating. The well was no longer a relic of abandonment or superstition, it was the center of a crime that had been meticulously hidden, a nightmare crystallized in stone and iron. Questions that had been whispered in fear now demanded answers. How long had the parents been imprisoned? How had the children maintained this deception with such calm efficiency? What had driven them to such extremes? The well, once a forgotten fixture of the woods, had become a witness, an accusatory monument to a horror that no one in the community could ignore. Even as evidence was catalogued and investigators took careful notes, a sense of dread lingered, heavy and almost tactile. The well had revealed the physical truth, but it also exposed something intangible: the methodical cruelty, the deliberate planning, and the quiet certainty of those who had committed the act. It was not merely the chains or the shadows that terrified, but the awareness that the horror had existed for so long, unnoticed, hidden in plain sight, and that the forest itself had been a silent accomplice, guarding its secret until the day it could no longer be contained. When the truth finally emerged, it was not a single revelation but a cascade of understanding that left the community reeling. The well, once a quiet feature of the forest, had become the epicenter of a nightmare that stretched beyond a single moment of cruelty. The evidence revealed a carefully orchestrated plan, one born of long years of isolation, simmering resentment, and the meticulous control the parents had exercised over their children. What had begun as whispers and shadows became undeniable. The horror was deliberate, sustained, and hidden so effectively that only the most careful observation could reveal it. The authorities pieced together a sequence of events that made the act horrifying not only for its immediacy but for its patience. The parents had been confined, their absence from the community explained away with rehearsed words, and their children had maintained the illusion of normalcy with unnerving precision. The physical remnants in the well, the rusted chains, the flattened earth, the traces of repeated human effort were only part of the story. The psychological weight of the crime, the way it had been planned and executed over weeks, months, and possibly years, revealed a darkness that extended far beyond the physical act itself. For the town, the horror lay not only in the act but in the realization that it had been allowed to exist unnoticed for so long. The neighbors, the hunters, the elders all had glimpsed fragments, oddities that might have been dismissed as eccentricities or superstition. Each small anomaly, the disappearance of the parents, the nighttime lanterns, the faint metallic echoes from the forest, was a piece of a puzzle that, once assembled, revealed a design of unimaginable cruelty. The isolation that had protected the family from scrutiny had also incubated the crime, allowing it to grow unchecked until the day the truth could no longer be denied. The well itself became a symbol of this hidden horror, a tangible reminder that appearances could be deceiving. What had seemed like an abandoned relic of the past was actually a carefully preserved site of suffering, chosen and maintained with deliberate attention. Every chain, every footprint, every scuff along the stone told the story of planning, of intention, of a family system twisted into a mechanism of control and terror. The revelation cast the forest and the homestead in a new light, transforming familiar paths into corridors of memory, each tree and shadow a witness to acts no one had imagined could occur in such a place. Even as the community absorbed the facts, a deeper unease remained. The horror was no longer hypothetical, it had been made real by evidence, by testimony, by the undeniable traces of human calculation. Yet beyond the specifics of chains and confinement lay a broader terror, the realization that darkness can thrive in silence, that isolation can be weaponized, and that the most horrifying acts are often those planned with patience and cold deliberation. The story of the parents chained in the well was a crime, but it was also a warning, a reminder that the secrets hidden in the shadows of familiar places can be far darker than anyone dares to imagine.